Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Abernathy. I am the Executive Director of the Committee for Education Funding. Welcome to the webinar. I will give a few seconds here for the rest of the folks to join, but wanted to start off by saying what CEF is and what we're hoping to accomplish with this webinar. CEF is the nation's oldest and largest education coalition. We are 118 different member organizations, institutions, and other entities that together advocate for a greater federal investment along the education continuum. At a time, this advocacy is more important than ever right now, at a time of great flux, I would almost say chaos and uncertainty about when education funding will be enacted, when it will be provided, and whether the administration will seek to withhold or rescind funding. All these actions can lead to less education funding, and I think will lead to less because states, school districts, colleges, and other grantees, if they can't count on the federal education funding, they are going to build their budgets without it. We also have an instance where the Department of Education is deciding on its own to not release all the funding that Congress has provided for it for fiscal year 25, which expires in less than 2 weeks. And I've been calling this a silent rescission because they aren't making specific notice that they're not releasing the funding. It's just not going to go out, and it will revert to the Treasury, much of it at the beginning of the new fiscal year. CEF has a lot of information about education funding on our website, and I'll put in the chat a link to our fiscal year 26 education budget book, which has information about almost every single national education program, what the president asked for it, and what Congress has been providing, and what the need is. And I'll also include a link to our current funding table that is tracking the proposals from the president, from the House Appropriations Committee, and the Senate Appropriations Committee for fiscal year 26. Today, our speakers are going to address some of the key issues that are impacting education funding right now. First, the changes in the federal role as a result of the budget reconciliation bill enacted this summer, and also from the from the administration's executive actions and the legal status of some lawsuits against them. The second panel will talk about the damage that happens when Congress or the administration delays decisions about funding to childcare centers, to school districts, and to the ability of universities to offer financial federal aid to students. We'll take questions after the speakers have completed their presentations for each panel. Feel free to submit any questions in the Q&A. And now I will turn it over to CEF's treasurer, Nicole Fuller with the National Center for Learning Disabilities, who introduce and moderate the first panel.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone again for joining CEF on this Tuesday afternoon. I'm excited to introduce these two panelists. They bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to today's conversation. I can first introduce Jared Bass. He is the Senior Vice President for Education at the Center for American Progress. He previously worked for both Congress and the administration on the House Appropriations Committee staff, where he helped shape COVID-19 relief legislation, and earlier as the lead higher education staffer on the House Committee on Education and Workforce Democratic staff. He worked at the U.S. Department of Education and for other education policy think tanks, including New America and Post-Secondary National Policy Institute. Before coming to Washington, D.C., Mr. Bass shaped policy at the state and local levels. He worked as a research fellow in the office of the Philadelphia City Council president and served as a legislative fellow in the Delaware House of Representatives. Second on our panel is Bob Kim, who is the executive director of the Education Law Center, which pursues justice and equity for public school students by enforcing their right to a high-quality education and safe, equitable, non-discriminatory, integrated, and well-funded learning environments. Mr. Kim has engaged in civil and education rights, law, and policy for more than 25 years, including as staff counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California and at the National Education Association. He's also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategic Operations and Outreach in the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Ed during the Obama administration. He is a leading expert and author in education law and policy and has written extensively on a wide range of legal and policy issues impacting public education. we're really excited to unpack changes to the federal role with these two. So with that, I will pass it to Jared, who will talk about the reconciliation bill that passed earlier this year and its impact on education.
Great. And thank you so much, Nicole and Sarah and the CEF for having me today. So I'm here just to, provide a brief overview of sort of the changes that happened in reconciliation and walk through some slides that I have. Are those slides, can people see those? Okay, great. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So as both Nicole and Sarah mentioned, I'll be focusing on budget reconciliation. So the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed out of Congress and signed by the president. The focus is, again, very big bill, but my focus is really going to be on student loan changes and also some of the tax changes affecting both higher education and also K through 12 education as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the really big buckets of changes that we saw coming through budget reconciliation really impacts grad students and grad student lending. So there was some back and forth between the House and Senate over the approach that they would take at the final in the final draft or final bill text. But really, we saw major changes to the grad student lending environment. So number one, the Grad Plus loan program was eliminated. Folks will remember that the Grad Plus program actually allowed eligible students to borrow up into the cost of attendance for their graduate education. That is no longer an option for those pursuing graduate level study. Also, we have some annual limits newly imposed for some of these on graduate students and professional students. So 20,500 for grad students. That's actually not a change from federal law, but what is this $50,000 annual loan limit on professional students. So professional students, please think things like medical school, law, dentistry, things of that sort. So you now have an annual cap of $50,000 for annual, for grad unsubsidized loans. And I should also say that this is all for unsubsidized loans. There's no subsidized offering for grad education. For the aggregate loan limits, so this is like cumulative what you're able to borrow. $100,000 limit was imposed for grad students in the aggregate. It's actually down from, I believe, 138,000 prior to the budget reconciliation bill, and then $200,000 for professional students. I want to be very clear that this is not inclusive of undergrad. This is just borrowing at the graduate level. However, the thing to note here is that even if you pay some of this down, you don't get that money back. So it's not on a rolling basis. So as soon as you hit 100,000, even if you paid some of that down, that's it. You're capped. You're done in the aggregate for graduate study, so master's degree of that sort of level. And the same thing for professional students. As soon as you hit $200,000 for professional oriented study, then that's all that is available to you, even if you pay that down. Next slide, please. Also changes for parent borrowers. So, in addition to graduate students, the Parent Plus program was not eliminated, but did see some major restrictions put in place. So, because of budget reconciliation, parent borrowers are basically limited to $20,000 per dependent, so per dependent student. And then in the aggregate, $65,000 per dependent student. So again, that can't be paid down. And as soon as an amount is hit or if that threshold is hit, then no more, there won't be further access to that program. Next slide, please. And then, so we talked a little about graduate loan borrowing and both for parents. And then overall, there are some changes based on the loan portfolio overall. So lifetime loan limits that are inclusive of both undergrad study and graduate study undergrad study and grad study, I should say, of $250,000, 500. This does not include any amount that's been taken out on, the parent takes out on behalf of a dependent student. That's not included in this limit. But again, with the other loans that we just talked about, once you hit this threshold, even if you receive forgiveness or pay that down or pay any of that back, that is the aggregate limit. And so as soon as you hit that cumulative lifetime borrowing limit, then you've exhausted your federal student loans across both all loan types, I should say, with the exception, again, of Parent Plus loans. The other thing to note is that the changes in OBBA for the loans that we talked about really will go into effect for July 1st, 2026. So even though the bill was passed this year, it really affects loans that are taken out on or after July 1st, 2026. Those are the changes that will be made. And then the new addition here, which affects loans of all types, is that they're prorated. So it used to be that if you were a part-time student, you could actually borrow up into the full annual loan limit for undergrad. I think it's like $5,500 for your first year if you're a dependent student. That is no longer the case. And so you actually will have your loan prorated based on enrollment intensity or enrollment status. So if you're part-time, say 50%, then you would get half that amount taken out. So that is a new change as well, occurring from the One Big Beautiful Bill Acts. Next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to changes to loans, there's also changes to what you can take out, how you can take that out, but also changes to how to pay that back, and that brings us to repayment plans. So really thinking about loan repayment plans in two tranches. There are the loans and repayment plans available to you prior to July 1st, 2026, and then the loans available after July 1st, 2026. So really going to concentrate more on the loans that are available after July 1st, 2026 through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which creates a new standard plan and a new repayment assistance plan. There is, a lot of complexity right now in this moment between the loans available to you prior to July 1st, 2026. You have access to standard, graduate, extended, and available income-driven repayment plans. But I think folks know that some of those have been challenged, and so we've seen, some of that curtailed. So thinking about income contingent repayment, and then, derivative plans like pay and repay. I believe pay is still available, but repay and save and the other plans using ICR authority have been challenged. Okay, next slide, please. So with the new standard plan, instead of it just being, 10-year plan, they've actually separated it into 4 distinct categories based on the loan balance. So it used to be that, you had a fixed payment over 10 years and regardless of loan balance, and that was what was given to you. And then you could have access to graduate and extended based on loan balance if you so preferred. But now it's based on your loan amount and then period of years associated with that. So if you owe less than $25,000, then you will have a 10-year standard repayment plan, the fixed monthly payments, all the way up into 25 years if you owe more than $100,000. So this is a new standard repayment plan than the standard repayment plan that we have currently. Next slide. There's also creation of a new repayment assistance plan. So this will become like the income-driven repayment plan or option for borrowers post July 1st, 2026. And then that option will be phased in, I should say, for all borrowers, regardless of when they borrowed a little bit later. But the repayment assistance plan provides a 30-year repayment window. So right now, I shouldn't say right now, but prior to the budget reconciliation or OBBA, there were options for 20 and 25 years. This one is going to be the longest repayment window for income-driven repayment assistance. The monthly payment will be based on your adjusted gross income, and that will range anywhere from 1% to 10% based on that income. A new thing here is that there'll be a $10 minimum payment. The $0 monthly payment is no longer an option. So even if you do qualify or would have qualified for $0 monthly payment before, you're still required to make a minimum monthly payment of $10. However, there is a $50 monthly reduction per dependent that you have in your household at that time. There is also no cap based on the standard plan monthly payment. One of the feature of some other repayment plans, or one in particular I'm thinking of, was that you couldn't pay more than the standard plan. However, that cap is removed here. So even if you would have paid less than the standard plan as far as like your fixed monthly payment, you could actually exceed that amount on this plan. But it also does eliminate negative amortization, and that's just seeing your loan balance grow because your monthly payments don't meet unpaid interest. So that phenomenon was actually eliminated under this repayment assistance plan. Next slide, please. All right, so moving into taxes, and just a quick overview here, we saw a modification to the endowment tax. So prior to OBBA, there was a 1.4% excise tax on net investment income. If you had a endowment that was worth a certain amount per student. That's been modified and changed here with a range from 1.4% to 8%. So if you have an endowment that's worth $500,000 to just under $750,000 per student, you get a 1.4% tax rate. All the way up to if that endowment per student is worth $2 million or more, it'll be an 8% tax rate. The thing to note here is that this only applies to private institutions, and that institution has to enroll 3,000 or more students. And there's no longer the requirement to exclude international students from that, although that was in consideration at one point. Next slide. The other big just tax change to mention here relates to vouchers. So, I think people may have been familiar with the Educational Choice for Children Act, or ECA. This is sort of modeled after, I think, ECA, but not exactly. This creates a $1,700 non-refundable tax credit to go to scholarship granting organizations who can then make scholarships to eligible students or individuals, including for things like private tuition for religious or private school, for tuition for private schools or religious schools. But just wanted to unpack this a little bit, just to look at some of the legislative text here and to explain a little bit more about what's allowed where SGOs or scholarship granting organizations, and just dig in a little bit more to the state participation piece. Next slide, please. So the first thing to dig in here is just on qualified elementary education or secondary expenses. This is just the language directly from the reconciliation text, which points us to specific statute or section within current law. If you could just go to the next slide. And this is what's allowed under that. So basically, you're allowed to use the private school voucher, or that tax or that scholarship, can be used to support qualified elementary and secondary education expenses that go beyond tuition. So things like fees, academic tutoring, special needs services. And the thing to note here is that it doesn't just have to be private or religious schools. It actually also includes public schools as well. But anyway, there's a whole range of opportunities for use of funds under this law that does not have to be specific to the voucher program or voucher program. Next slide. And then just noting here that the scholarship that's provided for eligible student, the eligible student can be in a household that's up to 300% of the area's median gross income. So if that median area gross income is $100,000, let's say for that household, then $300,000 would be an appropriate household that could receive a scholarship from a scholarship granting organization under this program. Next slide. And then the other thing just to note here is the scholarship granting organization. It has to be included or under the covered state. So here state participation really matters. So a state may not choose to participate in this program, or they could choose to participate in the program, but the SGO has to be approved by the state or a covered state in order to be eligible to make a scholarship to an eligible student. Next slide. And just some other information here about the SGOs is that they have to at least make 10 scholarships, 10 or more scholarships to students who don't all attend the same school. So it could be 9 and 1, and that would be satisfied under the law. 9 could all be going to the same school, one couldn't. And then 90% of the income has to go and be used for the scholarships to eligible students, although 10% can be reserved for the SGO's own use. So just pointing that out as well. And I think in an earlier slide, I mentioned that they can't be private foundations as well. Next slide. And then this was just a really cursory way just of explaining how this works for visual learners. So basically an individual who gets, who makes a donation to an SGL that is covered by a state or on that state list that will receive a tax credit from the federal government. There's a limit to that tax credit, which is $1,700. The thing just to know about tax credits and why they're very beneficial is that a tax deduction reduces your income that can be taxed, or the available income that can be taxed. Tax credits actually reduce your tax liability, so they take away the money that you would actually owe. It's non-refundable. There is a carry forward, so in case you don't get to use it one tax year, you can use it to future tax years. So quite an incentive here. It's at $1,700. That's the limit again. But once you make that contribution to the SGO, you are eligible for that tax credit. The SGO then can make a scholarship available to an eligible student to use for those elementary or those qualified elementary expenses that we talked about. And I think that is it as far as the basic overview. Look forward to Bob's presentation and questions a little bit later here.
Thank you, Jared. Really appreciated that overview. I do encourage folks to use the Q&A. We will have some time after Bob shares some insights to address questions from the audience. So feel free to put those in and we'll have some dedicated time. I can now pass it over to Bob, who will talk about the administration's executive orders as they pertain to education and give the status of some of the litigation and lawsuits that have been dealing with them, as well as reductions in force at the Department of Education. So I will pass it to you, Bob.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Sarah and CEF, for having me. Again, my name is Bob Kim. I'm Executive Director of the Education Law Center, and the slides, I think, are going to come up. There we go. Wonderful. And just as an overview, I was asked to talk a little bit about the role of the federal government in education, and so I thought I would talk about the legal actions around the Department of Education itself federally, and then talk a little bit about some of the executive orders that are affecting children and students. And then if we have time, just a little updates on the Supreme Court cases that came down in the past term. So probably won't have time to go over all of that, but let's just see how we do here. Next slide. And this is just a little information about Education Law Center. I'll leave that to later discussion. Next slide. And the issue areas that we work on. Sorry, so next slide. And our reach. Okay, so this was all boilerplate stuff. So next slide. So I thought I would just review for those that might not be as familiar with the role of the federal government, in particular the department. These are the main areas that the department covers. It does provide significant education funding. And many of you know this already, ranging the federal funding really makes up about between 5% and upwards of 20% of public school funding in the states. So it's really important, and in many states they really disproportionately are federally reliant on federal funding for education. The overall goals are to support high-need students, provide student aid to go to college, crucially to provide education data and research, and to incentivize that in universities around the country, to direct education policy, and then also critically to engage in civil rights enforcement. I used to work at the Civil Rights Office of the department during the Obama years, so I can talk a little bit more about that if that comes up. Next slide. And so the key offices then, and I won't go through all of these, but these are the offices throughout the department that really work on all kinds of policy from pre-K all the way through post-secondary, career technical education, and providing for the needs of specific student populations, such as students with disabilities and English learners, and providing for federal student aid, and also providing for education research nationally. Next slide. And so then when we talk about the dismantling that's happened, and just as review, we go all the way back to January, which sort of seems like the Jurassic era at this point. But when we go all the way back to January, remember there was the federal funding freeze, the DOGE related actions in February. Then you started to see the specific terminations of specific grants in research, teacher preparation, sort of DEI under like an anti-DEI justification to cancel specific contracts in the early part of the year. And then you started seeing these waves of actions to separate employees from the department itself, several hundred through the early months, and then a massive reduction in force in March. And cumulatively, all of those terminations make up more than half of the Department of Education federally through the March 20 executive order dismantling the department. And then even afterwards, we're seeing certain decisions made to kind of exodus some parts of the department to other agencies. For example, the Department of Labor, there was a interagency agreement to kind of transfer career technical education and adult workforce grants to the Department of Labor. I think we're seeing probably other actions as well, interagency to gradually reduce the functioning of the department. And then, of course, just as you all know, undoubtedly, there's so many other agencies that do have programs impacting children and students, prominently HHS, which controls Head Start. And so there are rifts also proceeding in those agencies as well throughout the year. Next slide. And then, so in terms of litigation specifically, there are three major cases to oppose the dismantling of the U.S. Department. My organization is involved in one of them, NAACP versus the United States. All three of the cases are going through some problems now with trying to stop the dismantling and trying to reinstate employees. You'll recall that the Supreme Court lifted the preliminary injunction in the Massachusetts cases in July. And then following that, in our case, the Maryland case, the federal district court denied our preliminary injunction just about a month ago in August. There's also been other related sort of more discrete pieces of litigation trying to stop aspects of dismantling, also facing problems in the courts, trying to get a preliminary injunction to stop the dismantling or reinstate employees. There was one notable victory, I think, the Victim Rights Law Center case that is resulting in a very slow return of a couple hundred OCR employees through the fall. But that even so, that's just sort of a trickling return of employees, and the case is still pending in the First Circuit, so we don't know the ultimate result of whether all of those employees will be restored or not. But even so, there's been over 60% of OCR staff have been terminated, and it really, to me, knowing that agency, that is a net effect of greater than 60% of loss of work because of all the reassignments in all those cases. It's really crippling the agency overall. Okay, next slide. And then just to talk about the executive orders for a couple of minutes, we don't have time to go over the dozens and dozens of executive orders related to civil rights and students, but I just thought I would focus on three areas and then really just talk about like one example of an executive order in each of these areas. But they, as you all know, there are probably many and maybe even dozens of executive orders that touch on some of these subject areas. So what I'm going through is just a sampling of the overall panoply of EOs out there. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to focus on DEI in particular, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry, is there a advancing of the slide here? Maybe it's not happening. Oh, thank you. So as you know, DEI is sort of the overall framing under which this administration is opposed to DEI-related activities. It's an extraordinarily vague term. and we'll discuss how, because of the vagueness, it's been challenged in numerous ways. But really, DEI has been the battering ram through which the Trump administration is trying to engage in all kinds of enforcement actions and reductions and eliminations of funding for specific institutions around the country. Just one EO here, you'll see talks about EO 14173. This was released early in the administration to terminate so-called affirmative action and diversity preferences throughout federal government. And this also affects schools in the wake of the Harvard case a couple of years ago in the Supreme Court ending affirmative action. So really, the administration is using that Harvard case to justify all kinds of actions that arguably go way beyond the limits of that Harvard Supreme Court case. So this is one DEI related executive order. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see that following that EO, this is how it sort of impacted education. In February 14, the administration issued a very broad Dear Colleague letter or guidance, basically prohibiting schools, both K-12 and higher ed, from using race in decisions pertaining to just about every aspect of campus life, like going way beyond admissions and student assignments to aspects of hiring and scholarships and student support programs, and really could, even extend to the classroom and what could be taught in schools. So it was based on the Civil Rights Act, but it went and also based and relied upon the Harvard case, but really was breathtaking in how broad it was and how extraordinarily vague it was, and sort of micromanaging of schools at all levels of education. And so the department issued that letter. It followed up with another Q&A in March, and even went so far as to issue compliance certificate, require schools to sort of send in certificates of compliance with this guidance. And then the next slide. So what that resulted in was a bunch of litigation that immediately were filed in different courts around the country. And you will see these courts all acting with almost uniform alarm. And to the extent that on the same day in April, all three federal courts ruled that this guidance issued by the Trump administration was almost certainly to be unconstitutional in numerous ways. Those initial rulings in April were followed up just a month ago by, at least in one court in Maryland. I didn't have a chance to follow up on the other cases, but the District Court of Maryland issued a memo upholding its earlier decision and held that the February 14 DEI guidance violated the APA, as well as was unconstitutional in numerous ways. The First Amendment, violated the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment, and was extraordinarily vague and unfollowable, essentially, by schools. So that's the status so far of that DEI guidance, and so the Trump administration is not allowed to enforce that guidance anymore. Next slide. So then moving on to another area of civil rights, limiting protections for LGBTQ plus students. So many executive orders out there trying to enforce this binary notion of gender and to sort of limit the rights of transgender students in numerous ways, including in education and also in healthcare. The one education-related EO that I'll focus on is this so-called Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports EO, which directs agencies, including the Department of Education, to restrict funding to programs that in which trans students are seeking to participate in athletics according to their gender identity, and this EO is trying to stop that from happening. The civil rights enforcement activity is also continuing to penalize schools for allowing transgender transgender girls and women to participate in sports. They're relying on that U.S. Supreme Court case Skermeti, which has nothing to do with transgender sports participation. That was a medical care case. However, the Trump administration is relying on it to go after schools that are trans inclusive in their athletics policies. So there's been a bunch of enforcement actions recently that are going on around the country. And all of this, by the way, is a follow-up activity to the reversion of this Trump administration to its own 2020 Title IX regulations governing civil rights activity in schools. The 2020 regulations were the ones that excluded protections for LGBTQ plus students. The Biden administration had issued regulations overturning that. And so now under Trump, we're back to the earlier 2020 Title IX regulations. And then I won't belabor it, but we should watch out to see upcoming cases in the next term regarding trans participation in sports. There's one case out of West Virginia that is at the high school level, and there's another case out of Idaho that deals with higher ed trans participation in sports. So those cases have been consolidated and will be heard in the next Supreme Court term. And then for the next slide. I'll just say, very briefly, that immigration is another big area in terms of civil rights and Trump policy. We all know this. The one relevant, I think, policy that I'll just mention briefly is the sensitive locations policy. This actually, to my knowledge, wasn't actually an EO, but it was a repeal of a Democratic administration policy to protect immigration enforcement and keep it out of sensitive locations, including but not limited to public schools. So we know that policy was rescinded earlier in the year. ICE and Border Patrol have resumed and amplified enforcement actions in areas including public school areas in recent months. There have been a lot of litigation to try to stop this with some limited success. We know that there's pending legislation to reinstall the sensitive locations protections. And I will just say that this is an area of concern for teachers and administrators all over the country, not helped by the recent Supreme Court decision to basically allow racial profiling in immigration enforcement stops. That was just a recent decision. So that's sort of adding gasoline to this area, to this fire. And then the related state actions, which really do call for some urgent attention, is that states are now trying to revive efforts to overturn Plyler versus Doe, which guarantees that undocumented students have a right to a free public education. There's legislation picking up all over the country at the state level to basically erect barriers for undocumented students, including by charging them tuition, which would be in direct violation of Plyler versus Doe. So there's a lot of really troubling activities in the area of immigrant rights, and just wanted to point those out and hopefully have later more discussion about that. And then next slide. And then finally, I'll just say, without going into depth about this, that there have been a few consequential Supreme Court decisions over the past term. The one that my organization was involved with to some extent was the Oklahoma charter schools case. This was a case that had the Supreme Court decided to overturn the Oklahoma Supreme Court's decision, there would have been, for the first time, religious public schools and the allowance of religious public charter schools in particular across the country. But for Justice Roberts deciding he wasn't ready for that, there would have been religious public schools for the first time in this country. But instead, the court deadlocked at 4-4. And so now, for the time being, there are to be no religious public charter schools in the country. But we know that this issue is not going away. It'll probably come back to the Supreme Court within the next couple of years. And so the question is, how should states prepare for that possibility. And of course, the funding impacts of sharing public funds with private religious schools is quite alarming, and I think something that we all need to prepare for as a fiscal matter, as a policy matter. The Mahmood versus Taylor case, many of you may know, this is where the Supreme Court ruled that parents have a religious free exercise right to opt their children out of LGBTQ plus curriculum in public schools. So because there's a newfound right now for First Amendment reasons to yank your child out of that curriculum, the question is, how will schools manage that opt-out process? Will they have to sort of imagine what religious objections there might be to various aspects of the curriculum and come up with some kind of notice and opt-out and notice policy to sort of enforce this new constitutional right that the Supreme Court has granted. And then finally, I'll just mention the major disability rights case of the term was largely favorable from a civil rights perspective. The court held that that parents should not have a higher burden of proof in school discrimination cases under federal civil rights laws. It shouldn't be higher than the standard in parallel cases in non-education discrimination cases under those same laws. So it's basically saying you shouldn't have to prove some crazy high standard to prevail in a civil litigation case around disability rights. So there might be an uptick in disability rights related grievances against school districts across the country. But I think, this was not a surprising case. I think it was just a case that was affirming that there should be no special barriers for students with disabilities in these types of actions. And then I think that's it following. Let's see, next slide. I think that's it. Okay, back to you.
Thank you, Bob. That was such a comprehensive overview, and I appreciated you ending on that last case, which was, to put my own NCLD hat on, certainly a win for disabled children. As a reminder, we have about 15 minutes left with Jared and Bob, which provides ample time for Q&A. There's a couple of questions already in there, but I encourage attendees to put their questions in. We also have a few questions already prepared, but we want to prioritize questions from the audience. So there are 2 questions already in there, I believe for you, Jared, but either of you are welcome to respond about the federal tax credit program and the mechanics of it. The first one is, do scholarship granting organizations have to work only in a state, or can they be national organizations?
So I should say at the outset that we're still waiting on rulemaking for a lot of this. So Treasury will actually provide parameters and I think give more color to what was in the legislation. This SGO does have to be approved within the state, so states have to participate, and it has to operate, has to be within a covered state, according to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that I think would limit it to just state within state boundaries for sure. But still would look to federal regulations to provide more clarity around that. And Bob, I don't know if you have thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I think from what I know so far, which is not that much, I do think that we're still waiting for the Treasury Department to issue the more specific guidance to who or what can be an SGO. It is just worth noting overall that governors do have and states do have the right to opt out of this program. And given what we know about state vouchers and the effects on school funding, and also the effects that private vouchers have on allowing more and more students to enter school environments that are not subject to any civil rights laws. From a civil rights advocacy perspective and a school funding advocacy perspective, we hope that there will be policies developed and that states will not feel that they need to join this federal voucher program, even if there are some benefits afforded to public school students. Largely, the program is intended to transfer funds and provide funds for private and religious education. So there's really significant implications for a vast expansion of a new federal voucher program across the country.
Thank you, Bob. And you both touched on this with states, having the decision to opt in or opt out. There's a second question about whether that decision or that choice is falling to the governor or the state legislature.
It depends. So based on the text of the budget reconciliation bill, depends on who, like under state law, has the authority for tax benefits. So it says the governor or individual or entity within the text that's like responsible for like entering into like new tax benefits. So it's going to depend state to state. Like it might be a governor's decision in some states under state law, might fall to someone else that's lower than the governor or to the state legislature, but it just really depends on state law.
Thank you. Those were the only two questions in the chat. I think we have a few more before or a little bit more time before we turn to our second panel. So a question that I have for you, Jared, is what you envision or what you're starting to hear may be likely for early responses to the reconciliation bill, whether it pertains to states and how they are looking at the voucher program, how states are looking at their overall budgets and potential cuts to education funding as a result of Medicaid cuts. I know that you didn't touch a lot or really much at all in the presentation about Medicaid, but that's certainly another part of this bill. So I just will give you some space to kind of see what you're hearing about state action and likely responses.
Yeah, so I think on the voucher issue in particular, and I think Bob got into this, like it's going to be up to states to decide like whether or not they participate in the program. I think some states are eyeing it as, hey, is this an opportunity to, move forward with choice, which again would be like, detrimental to public school education in this country. I think others are looking into, is there a way to use this not for, that benefit, but actually to support academic tutoring, technology, and to be able to use that dollar for dollar, non-refundable tax credit to actually support public schools. And so I think Brookings has done some work on this and thinking about like, it's a bad program, but if you squint at it, it might make sense, So unclear, but I think that's one thing that people are waging or just like, considering right now, weighing. So I think that's one. I think, states are in a tricky spot because education was not like the only issue that was addressed within, the reconciliation bill. We had massive cuts to healthcare, in this country, about $1 trillion was taken out of healthcare programs, most of that because of Medicaid. Also, SNAP saw like over $100 billion in reduction of benefits. And so that has real implications for not only college students and students themselves and their families, but also has huge implications for states because historically, states have had to look to offset budget constraints or strains because of Medicaid and those issues. And where do those come from? They have come historically from higher education. But also if we're in an environment now where there are really steep cuts to healthcare benefits, to services, states have to either make up for that loss at the federal level or cut those services. So it really could cross over into K through 12 education as well. But historically, higher education has been squeezed when it comes to Medicaid and Medicare. Medicaid and SNAP. The other thing that I didn't get a chance to mention is we saw like this transition out of the graduate student loan portfolio. And the issue, not necessarily for states, although states may be involved with that, is like where are those folks going to go? And it's going to be the private loan market. So we also expect to see an uptick in private lending, for folks who can afford to like avail themselves of the private lending option. But the private market is not great for everyone who doesn't have that credit worthiness attached to themselves or have a co-signer with that credit worthiness. So what that means for this country is that we might see the loss of like a lot of graduate professionals coming out of low-income backgrounds who don't have access to the capital to be able to afford that education.
I will say, will add one thing about the Medicaid cuts that you mentioned, Jared. I mean, I feel like they really do impact public schools so much. I was not aware of how much Medicaid was relied upon by public schools to pay for a bunch of services, mental health counseling, and so forth in public schools. So it really does have a direct impact on school funding in a way that I think we're all beginning to appreciate more now. And also the way that state funding formulas are calculated, many of them rely on a so-called direct certification method, which really picks up, tracks the number of families that rely on public benefits and uses that to calculate the per pupil funding that goes to districts and schools in those states, relying on those direct cert counts. So lowered benefit uptake federally in these programs may have an impact on school funding formula and distributions in a way that I think states will really need to grapple with in the next year or two.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. And actually, as you were speaking, one of the questions came in about anticipated impacts on school-based services with current Medicaid cuts. So that's certainly something we are talking about at CEF as well. And I think I appreciate you raising that. There's a question too, I think, Jared, if you're able to touch on this quickly, about plus loan limits, if they apply to existing loan balances, or do the limits only apply to new loans initiated after July 1st, 2026?
Yeah, so there's like a lot of weirdness here. So the loan limits that we talked about for Parent Plus borrowers are July 1st, 2026 and going forward. However, I think that there is a phase out. Please double check this though, of like 3 academic years or something like that, where it's actually like you can have this available for a certain amount of time. But the 65,000 aggregate and also the 20,000 for per dependent student, I believe is July 1st, 2026 going forward. But I think that there is a phase out across all the loan offerings for like sort of like legacy issues. But I think it's 3 academic years. It is for some of the other ones, but just would double check for the Parent Plus loan program. I should say award years, maybe not academic years, but anyway.
Shifting gears a little bit, we still have a couple minutes. So, Bob, I think it could be really helpful if you could talk about the ways that we've seen the Department of Ed missing some of the statutory requirements. And we know that, you covered this in your presentation. The administration has been firing agency staff and cutting funding, but we do understand there are statutory obligations, like some of those requirements. I would love to hear from you if there is recourse if the Department of Education does not follow the law in spending funding or providing data as it is required under current laws.
Yeah, it's a really great question and a really big problem because as the staff is getting cut, they still have all these underlying obligations to issue reports, to meet certain obligations programmatically. And so even if there's no specific intent to evade all of those requirements, like there's not the staff that exists to carry out those required functions. I mean, just one example was the Department of Education missing a June deadline set forth by Congress by statute to submit a congressionally mandated annual report on the condition of education. And the department simply does not have the capacity to track or produce that congressionally required report due to the decimation of the staff in IES and specifically NCES. So these are big problems, and there's dozens and hundreds, I would say, of congressionally required obligations, deadlines, mandates across big statutes, like some small statutes, but also big statutes under ESEA, under the Higher Education Act, under all the Civil Rights Acts, Titles 6, 9, disability rights laws, and so forth. So these are not small congressional requirements, they're big ones, and Congress really has a role here to enforce its own laws that are being flouted and to also enforce the Impoundment Control Act, that is the congressional statute that requires the executive branch to seek congressional approval before rescinding or deferring funds or stopping certain activities, which would essentially mean those funds are going unused. And so we saw over the summer, actions by the states to legally try to restore those impounded funds. And that was eventually successful, as we all know, through a lot of political and policy action and advocacy, including among Republican leaders of Congress and in states. But there's an act, none of this is supposed to be happening, both because of that Impoundment Act process, but also because of the underlying statutes that govern all of these programs. That it really is tremendously sad that because of the dismantling, so many carefully crafted congressional policies over the decades are now not being followed. And so it will require advocacy action, such as what we saw over the summer, but also in some cases, further legal action.
Thank you. And CEF has written letters. All of our letters are on our website for anyone who needs to reference them. I think with that, I would love to just extend gratitude and thank you to Jared and Bob for your expertise and sharing your insights with those on today. And with that, I will pass it to Sarah, who will moderate and introduce our second panel.
Thank you both so much. And, as a budget geek and non-lawyer, I find this all very fascinating. I can go on about the Impoundment Control Act, but I can't go on about what the courts have done, and possibly about what the impact on colleges and students will be to these massive changes in student aid and loan repayment plans that we'll see going forward. So thank you both very much. And you are welcome to stay on, but understand if you need to drop off. As we go to the next panel, our legislative conference always tries to cover a mix of things that are about current events and things that Congress is doing or has the power to control. And this next panel has three experts, practitioners covering different parts of the education continuum who can talk about the impact of some of the things Congress has done or not done that resulted in delaying funding being released to childcare centers, providing information to colleges about what the level of student aid would be, providing information to states and school districts about what funding levels will be for programs, and then possibly not, as we saw and was just referenced this summer, not releasing almost $7 billion of it on the date that it was required by law to be released. So let me introduce the panelists and then they will each talk. And if you've got questions for them, please submit it in the Q&A. Going in order of the education continuum, we're going to start with Horace Turner, who for the past 16 years has worked as a licensed family child care provider and is the owner of the Horace Turner Child Care in Stanislaus, California. Mr. Turner currently cares for 21 children, infants, toddlers, and school-age children through age 13 at his home, operating from 2 a.m. to midnight, Monday through Saturday. That is 22 hours a day, 6 days a week. The majority of the children have some of the costs of their care subsidized by federal funding. Next, we have Dr. Bill Chapman, who in June 2024 was named Superintendent of the London Independent School District in Corpus Christi, Texas. He is the President-elect of the National Rural Education Association, which is a member of CEF. He has previously served as Superintendent of Palacios for 4 years, spent 8 years as Superintendent in Jarrell, Texas, and also served as a school administrator in Cold Spring, Willis, and Huntsville. Before he became administrator, he was a teacher and a coach. He was recognized as Superintendent of the Year for Region 13 in 2018, and again by Region 3 in 2024. Bringing up the higher education perspective, Alex DeLonis, God, I knew I was going to struggle. Alex DeLonis, I have a mental block about your last name, I'm so sorry, is Assistant Vice President for Student Financial Services at St. Louis University and serves on the Board of Directors for the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. NASFA is also a CEF member. With over 15 years in financial aid leadership at universities and community colleges, he has helped shape national initiatives on FAFSA, which is the student aid application form, FAFSA simplification, and college cost transparency. With that, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Turner to give his presentation, and then we'll go to Dr. Chapman and then Mr. DeLonis.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Horace Turner, as I was stated before. And I want to thank you guys for allowing me to be here to share the information and the process of the uncertainty of the federal funding has impacted our childcare business, me as an early educator, and the children and families I serve. I'm honored to be here with my colleagues in PK-12 and higher education. Also, I've been scrambling to adapt to the uncertainties, the budget uncertainties, and appreciate the solidarity and support of this community. And to the Congressional staff working in this federal investments in childcare and education, a huge thanks to all. I'm relieved that the federal childcare funding has not been crawled back to or frozen like other education funding has experienced. But we have experienced a significant setback due to actions by the Trump administration that I will detail. For the past 16 years, I worked as a licensed family childcare provider, caring for infants, as you heard earlier, toddlers and school-age children from out of my home in Stanislaus County. That's out of California. I currently serve 21 children from infancy to age of 13. My program operates from 2 in the morning, Monday through Saturday to midnight, depending on the family's needs. 3 children of those 21 are private pay, and 19 of them are subsidy enrolled programs, children. So with that, in fact, that's where it really hits the pocketbook, because it's not the fact that I won't receive, the fact that the parents are having a hardship of getting that support and figuring out how they're going to go to work. That's a program funded by Child Care Development Block Grants, CCDGB, and as a federal funded grant, matching requirements for the states. The majority of the families I would not be able to afford to care for the children without the CCDBG grant. That means their parents would not likely be able to be employed without the CCDGB grant. This is an important program that I work hard to strengthen by joining in advocacy efforts with my union and the stakeholders and in the Congressional. I am the leader of my union, UDW, United Domestic Worker, ASME Local 3930. I was elected to the bargaining team for my 3rd session. We're bargaining in partnership with SEIU in 99 and SEIU Local 521 as a partnership of Childcare Providers United. As you see on my screen, my background. For the past year and a half, I met with the union sisters and brothers and with the state to hash out our 3rd contract, which is still at a point of we're ratifying right now. To cover more information, more than 60,000 providers, home-based child care providers participating in the subsidy program across the state of California. We are the largest country, in this country, we're the largest child care union. Bargaining is how we work with the state to negotiate wages and benefits. Now, the union, via bargaining and organizing, we have been driving this force to improve and the benefits of childcare providers to stabilize the workforce. Childcare providers have been leaving the field because they can't earn a living wage. The childcare sector is in crisis, with the families scrambling to find childcare they need, and they often piecing together the less than ideal options for the hours that they need to and at the rate they can afford. As I said earlier, you look at the hours at work, most people would not want to do that. My union we work with secures a living wage and benefits is a key piece of stabilizing the workforce and helping working parents to access affordable, high quality childcare that meets their needs. Now, bargaining is never easy. We are fighting for our livelihoods, for the children and families that we'll work for, that we care for, that we love in our home. We come in with a set of asks in our bargaining team meets regularly with decision makers, in our case, the state of California. Until we reach an agreement that we then take to our members to vote on to ratify, which we have, there's a lot of back and forth over weeks, months, sometimes even years. Outside forces significantly impacted our negotiations. Those outside forces include the changes in the federal funding, changes in the federal policies that impacted the state, and the changes in the state economy forecast. During the course of the bargaining, all three of these forces changed considerably. Funding is usually reliable and stable, but the change in this year under the Trump administration has shown no signs of stability. The draft funding, the bill to wrap up the financial years of 2025, funding in the year last year did not result in the final deal in the strength of until March of this year. CCDG was flat funded. The president budget proposal, a second year on the flat funding for the fiscal year beginning October 1st. While these children that we care for, funding was not frozen or cut, but nearly every social service program was added, even more uncertainties to our field and impacting many of the providers and our families who rely on us. Unprecedented tariffs were proposed. California has a huge, robust economy, and a chunk of the economy is based on the trade. The president's tariff, especially those key trading partners in our states of Mexico, China, Canada, and the chaos surrounding the tariffs around the governor's downgrading the state economy forecast. In May, beginning to talks about the budget deficit. And then one big bad bill came along. The law that shifted enormous medical and SNAP costs across the state. Our negotiation changed at each of these points when the December bill funding was rejected and became a CR. When the funding freeze occurred earlier this year, when the president created this tariff and the recapitalization, the bill cut federal resources from medical, SNAP, and other programs. All these changes are deeply impacted as a provider of California, and all the bargaining efforts are focused on improving the pay and the benefit for our child care providers. Why? Because all providers, those federal actions were taken away from child care and taken away from California and putting a strain on the state ability to maintain essential social services. And because California had less money to bring to the table, we face increasingly uphill battle to improve pay and benefits for child care providers across the state. Just last month, we finally reached an agreement with the state to provide a 1.3% COLA each year for 3 years, totaling $37 million, to maintain the $80 million retirement, $15 million training fund, and to continue to reimburse in the healthcare coverage. And based on the numbers of children cared for and provided location, that's a totally $90 million, and continue to work towards reimbursement on a true cost of providing care. These are all significant wins, and I'm very grateful, but in no small part to concern about the state's stability in its budget. We're still unable to expand to the essential benefits, and considering that we are unable to make the future progress towards compensation childcare providers based on the true cost of care. That's true cost of care. Currently, we're caring at a 30% rate. 70% is on us. California still is a setback based on the outdated, irrelevant market surveys, and it captures only the rates that our hardworking parents can afford rather than the actual costs. Other states are working on efforts to include Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia, Delaware, Nevada, and South Carolina. But the administration's recent actions may well threaten the progress towards equitable compensation in these states as well. But I know this contract means good for things for me and my fellow union members. Some of us were able to afford glasses and receive dental before joining the union. In securing these benefits, some providers have been delaying the importance and at the time of life-saving procedures like chemo, cancer treatment, because they couldn't afford either healthcare insurance or the healthcare costs. Childcare providers take care of children and they forget to take care of themselves. But when they're forced to take care of themselves, they got to be able to have that cost to rely on. But now we now can, and our members know that we will get some relief by this modest pay raise and a one-time payment, and we'll bring our concerns back to the bargaining table, hopefully in a time where the federal investments are more robust, more stable, and the cuts from the recapitalization have been rolled back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. I appreciate hearing from you. We'll turn next to Dr. Chapman and then to Mr. DeLonis, and then we'll take questions.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Once again, my name is Bill Chapman. I currently serve as the superintendent of London ISD, which is a rural fringe school just outside the city of Corpus Christi on the Texas Gulf Coast. This is my 14th year as a superintendent in Texas, all of them at rural schools. I served for 8 years at Gerald and then 4 years at Palacios, also on the Texas Gulf Coast, before coming here to London. I've been a member of the Texas Rural Education Association for all those 14 years, as well as a member of the National Rural Education Association the last few years on the board, and I'm currently serving as a president-elect, and will take over in January as the president of the National Rural Education Association. I want to bring a perspective of a school district. We're one of 1,200 districts in Texas. Most Texas school districts are a September 1 budget year, meaning you adopt your budget at the end of August for the next school year. There are some that are on a July 1 budget, and I'm really glad I'm not them, to be honest with you. It was much worse for them this year than others. Also in Texas, it was a legislative year, so all kinds of changes come down. In Texas, our schools are funded off of property taxes. And so once during the summer months, we're waiting for our local appraisal districts to solidify our property tax rates to kind of determine our numbers. And so we work all spring and summer long to calculate our budget so that we can adopt it the last week of August as we get the school year. Every budget year is fun. Every budget year, you're trying to do more with less each and every year. In Texas, we laugh and joke. Realistically, there was one guy who could make a really big spreadsheet that would calculate how to figure out how much money you get each year. And that one guy used to work for the state. Now he works for a private company, makes a whole lot more money doing the exact same thing he did. But without his spreadsheet, we would all be dead in the water. And so basically, you put all your information in the spreadsheet and it pops out what you have. It includes, your federal funds, your state funds, your local funds, all that kind of stuff. And so how all that mumbo jumbo happens, we adopt a budget. Like many school districts across the state and across the United States, personnel is the largest part of our budget. It really is between most schools, between 75 and 80% of your budget falls to personnel. And when I first became a superintendent, I felt that myself and the board had a little more say in the budgeting process. Over the last few years, once the board figures out what they want to pay people, everything else is really done. There's really not many decisions to make because you're working with a finite amount of money, and each year that number gets a little different. I am blessed to be in a growing school district. We're an odd rural district. We're just outside the fringe of Corpus Christi, and we're actually growing about an 8% rate because we're one of the only schools in the area that has land to build in. And so they are building homes in our area quite a bit. We have about a $19 million budget annually. What that translates to is about 128 teachers, about 220 total staff, and about 1,930 students pre-K through 12. I am blessed to be in the school district. My other two districts were very different than I am here. In previous schools, I had much larger ELL populations and a much larger low SES populations. And that comes into play when you're making your budget, especially some of those federal monies you get for Title II, Title I, special ed flows through. And so those areas can impact every school differently. And so we had to make decisions this year. But I had other friends that as those title funds were frozen and we didn't know what was going to happen all through this budgeting process, there were a lot of schools, including mine. I zeroed out my title, the Title IIs, all those little parts of our budget, because we didn't know what we were going to do until we got that word probably end of August, early September, or end of July, early August, that, oh, by the way, we will get these funds to you. But that created a lot of unknowns to schools. And when you're in the middle of a budget process and that's happening, that changes everything you do. And so that was a very, very difficult piece. In my role in TREA for the last 2 years, I've been the chair of the legislative committee, and we have two huge priorities that we really focus on when going to Washington to talk about schools. One of those is the safe and rural schools, and all you on here may not know what that means. But basically, years and years ago, schools in areas where the federal government was actually involved, federal forests, where federal lands were taking up part of that school district, the federal government would send money to those counties, those schools, to help secure those areas so nothing could happen to them. And so this has been, I mean, the Safe and Rural Schools Act has been authorized, I want to say for 30-something years, I believe. And right now, it still hasn't been reauthorized. So I have friends in rural schools across the nation, in Texas. California is a big piece of this, where they're having to cut staff because it has not been reauthorized. It's being held up in the House. The Senate has reauthorized it several times. The House, for some reason, has not been taking care of it. It is hurting small rural schools, many of them from Republican-led areas. These are not things happening in urban districts. These are happening in those small rural areas across the country. And so that's one big thing. The second thing is trying to work with Congress to fully fund IDEA. IDEA affects our kids who are in most need, our special education students. This is the 50th anniversary of IDEA. It has been, it's never an issue of it being served or funded by the federal government. However, the most that was ever allocated to spend on IDEA is about 12%. And so from an NREA perspective, this is one of those things that if it was fully funded to the levels that Congress authorized 50 years ago, this would help every single school in the country. And I say this because we're required by law to service these kids at the level they need. The federal government funds us at 12%. The state comes back to some. In my previous school district, it was getting up to we were cutting in about $500,000 to $700,000 a year of local funds to expend towards taking care of our federally required IDEA students. And what happens is when you have to take your local funds, take care of those kids, it takes other programs away from the other kids. At that district, we were about 20% of our population was classified as special education. So that extra $500,000 was being spent on that 20% of the population, when if it had been funded at a higher level, that money could go back and help all of the kids. And so there are impacts at the federal level that do make a large difference in school districts, especially small districts across the country. And so we really want to make sure that our big goal NREA is making sure our rural and small schools don't get overlooked, because unfortunately, we all know that when legislators take action, they take action towards the large, big problems, but don't always see what happens at the smaller schools and the rural schools, which are fighting a totally different animal than what our urban and suburban school districts are handling across the country. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. That's really helpful to hear. And the percentage of full funding that special ed covers, this is like a weird anomaly of a budget world, but that full funding, quote unquote, full funding for special ed would mean that the federal government paid 40% of the extra cost of educating children with special needs. And in fact, what you mentioned was that in general, the federal share, instead of being that 40% full funding, is actually averaging right now about 10%. And I think at one point was, except for one weird year, the most it's been has been 12 or 13%. So that is a lot of money that the state and local schools, state and local budgets have to make up from their own coffers that they wouldn't have to spend if the federal government provided full funding. So
we're required to do it, and we
right.
do it because we take care of kids.
And there's actually a lot of other things. I mean, for instance, civil rights laws require that schools educate children in a language where they can understand it. So even if the federal government cut out all the $890 million it currently provides for English language acquisition, which is a proposal on the table, state and local governments would have to find that money because that English language learning has to be provided. So enough of my rant on this. Let me turn to our third and final speaker, Alex DeLonis.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Bill and Horace. That was extremely informative, and I'm a much more wise man at this point from after hearing you two speak. So thank you for that. A little bit more about me, and then I'll tell everyone a little bit more about SLU, and then I'll kind of dig in from the higher education perspective. So Alex DeLonis, Sarah said, I'm the Assistant Vice President for Student Financial Services at St. Louis University. But prior to SLU, I was Associate Dean for Enrollment and Director of Financial Aid at Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And prior to that, I started my career at 3 different community colleges between Indiana and Illinois. But all financial aid work. That has been my entire career over the past 16, 17 years. So a little bit more about St. Louis University for those who don't know, a private nonprofit institution in Midtown St. Louis, Catholic Jesuit University. We enroll around 15,000 students a year. On the undergrad side, we generally bring in about 24% Pell Grant recipients per year. We do have graduate programs, professional programs, law school, medical school. We disperse about $500 million in aid per year, which most of that comes from SLU, comes from St. Louis University resources. And I myself am a first-generation Pell Grant recipient, college graduate. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, I've experienced myself personally. So maybe we can start by just, I'm going to flip it a little bit. Maybe imagine yourself as a high school senior again, right? Greatest time of your life, carefree. Nothing to worry about except trying to make a college decision, right? One of the biggest choices you will ever make in your life. You've worked hard, you've gotten your acceptance letters, and now you're comparing financial aid offers to figure out where you can afford to go. So not only where you want to go, but where you can afford to go. One school gave you a financial aid package, but from what you can tell in the language, it has estimate written all over it. And there's uncertainty about the federal aid in that package. Another school is holding back. They're saying they can't even put the financial aid information in there related to federal aid because they don't know what the information is yet. Weeks go by and suddenly both schools update your aid offer because finally they have information on what those funding levels are. From your perspective as a student or as a parent, this is confusing, this is frustrating, and it makes you wonder, can I trust these numbers? Can I actually afford to go to college? And for many low-income first-generation families, that uncertainty alone is enough to delay a decision or even make them step away from the process altogether. Now let's flip the perspective to look on the college side. The FAFSA typically opens October 1st, and we have a promise this year that it will open on October 1st. And many colleges work hard to send out initial aid offers by December before students head off for winter break, so that families have plenty of time to weigh their options, over their holiday celebrations and drinking eggnog or whatever they're doing during that time. That means that we're building financial aid packages long before Congress has usually finalized federal funding levels. When funding isn't resolved or when the department delays confirming allocations, aid offices are forced into a choice. Do we award conservatively or flat based on last year, which could discourage students from enrolling, or do we build anticipated increases which might later end up in pulling aid back and confusing students even more. Neither option is good. Both create extra work for staff who have to repackage awards and recommunicate with families. This also puts a financial strain on institutions trying to make the most of our funds available to students for expenses for the institution. So let's look at FY25 as an example. This past year, I think, kind of displays the problem clearly. In March, Congress passed continuing resolution that didn't specify funding levels for Pell, SEOG, or federal work studies, and schools were left in limbo. It wasn't until late March that we got final campus-based authorizations, and not until the end of May that the department confirmed the maximum Pell Grant would remain the same as last year. That confirmation came right in the middle of yield season. So May 1 is the national deposit deadline for most schools. And remember, in this scenario, my aid offers from St. Louis University have been on the street since December and have been rolling on a weekly basis since then. In years where the dollar amount changes, schools have to send mixed messages. Aid administrators either have to estimate or later reissue awards or hold them back, which risk losing students and not giving them the clarity they need, and neither path is fair for students. In cases where programs like Pell, SEOG, or federal work study are drastically cut or eliminated at any point, we know that's bad. But that time of year would even be more catastrophic based on the decisions families have already made. And at SLU, you can see how the confusion ripples out. In August alone, my office answers about 5,000 phone calls in that single month. That's not counting the foot traffic where we see hundreds of students a week and the countless emails from students and families, many of them asking questions that sometimes we can't answer with certainty. Every time funding levels shift or are delayed, it means repackaging, recommunicating, and re-explaining to thousands of students and parents. The back and forth puts a real strain not only on families, but also on the staff working tirelessly to support them. And if we're being real with ourselves, going back to your teenage self again, or maybe how teenagers think today, you get 2 or 3 different aid offers with changing numbers, and they're probably going to say, like, this is sus. And they'd be right. From their perspective, it doesn't inspire confidence, right? These disruptions hit hardest at schools serving large numbers of low-income students, where every dollar of Pell, SEOG, and work study makes a real difference. This is SLU, but I'm also thinking about my community college friends, where the only type of aid in most cases going out is federal or state aid. Meanwhile, families with more resources can commit early with confidence, and the result is an inequity in who can make timely, informed college choices. That's why predictable, timely funding matters. It's not just about when Congress or the department meets a deadline. It's about whether schools can trust the numbers in front of them and whether they feel confident. When students can trust the numbers in front of them and kind of feel confident to make their college choice. And when decisions are delayed, the uncertainty hits all the way down to the teenager sitting at their kitchen table, trying to figure out if college is a financial possibility for them. And the trust they lose isn't with the federal government. It's actually with the school they're communicating with. That's us taking the brunt of that. So I will close with that. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think, as it should be, a student just sees their education, or a child goes to a child care center. They don't know and they don't care whether the funding that supports them is a braided mixture of federal, state, local, private funding, but they just see the end result of what they get. And I think that's the difficulty when the federal component is so uncertain, as it has been this year, in a very different way than it has been in the past. Some of you mentioned that, the fiscal year 25 funding law wasn't enacted until it was like mid-March. Dr. Chapman, you mentioned the uncertainty this summer when the Department of Ed announced on June 30th that it wasn't going to release $6.9 billion of state formula grant funding, money that normally goes out the door pretty automatically to states that have turned in program applications that meet the criteria. And the Department of Ed has, well before July 1st, talk to states if there's a problem with their application. And so suddenly this money was in doubt for almost a whole month, and then it was released. So in fact, there's a question submitted in the Q&A from someone who recently moved from the Houston area to DC and had friends who were ESL coaches that were tentatively impacted by possibly not receiving the Title III, which is the English language acquisition funding that was being withheld for the whole month. And question for you is, if you had a magic wand, what would you suggest that we, and I think maybe the question is we, Congress, could do or could implement to safeguard these funds and to protect them from the threat of revocation? I will say that the fiscal year 26 education funding bill that the Senate Appropriations Committee approved recently on a strongly bipartisan measure has language in there that says the money must be provided to states on the date that the bill says it must be released. That bill has not yet been signed into law, and this House Appropriations bill does not have similar language.
That's a perfect world scenario that works great for us. The bottom line is not knowing. I'll be honest with you. I zeroed out my federal dollars this year. My district with my population, I don't get a large number of those federal dollars in regards to the Title III, ESL, ELL funds, but we zeroed them out. Other schools I've been in, friends of mine, if they zero out those funds, they are dropping services to kids. Point blank, they're cutting ESL programs, but we can't cut the programs. The state has to get there. So something's going to get cut. What it is may not be that program, because again, like you mentioned, we're required by law to provide those services. There's other laws in place. We must provide those services. We're also held accountable to state assessments and to make sure we meet scores on the state and federal level. If we don't provide ELL services, we're going to ding ourselves. And so something somewhere on the extraneous areas are going to get cut. What that is varies from school to school. But you're correct. As long as if the dollars are promised, produce the dollars. If we know they're coming, we can plan for them. If we know they're not coming, we can plan for them. It may not be easy. It may not be great. It may not be fun, but we can plan for them. What really hurts a school, and again, we have 1,200 districts in the state of Texas, is if you are planning one thing and you think you have it and you plan for it, something mid-year having to cut is a lot more difficult than doing it up front. And so just be upfront, be honest, and let us know what we can and can't get. And once you say we're going to get it, let us keep getting it. That's the simplest thing we can say.
Thanks. And I have a question for Mr. Turner. It's now less than 2 weeks before the start of the new fiscal year, and Congress hasn't enacted funding, which is not uncommon. The House released just before this briefing began proposed bill that would extend funding at current rates until November 21st, but the House and Senate have yet to pass that, or actually to start discussing it. Curious, how do you, as a child care provider, do you have to do anything different to prepare, or do you change anything that you do, knowing that it's not clear what the subsidy rates will be for the parents who are sending their children to your childcare, or do you just have to maintain total flexibility, not knowing what you might be getting?
That is a great question, Sarah. And the way I like to approach it is, we are still currently on regional market rate. We've spent 2.5 years identifying what the true costs to care for a child. And it came out resounding 70% that we're not given to just cover the basis of what it costs to care for a child. And I'm sure that's across the education spectrum, but for the early education, we're already taking hit on top of hit to be able to provide. And as I live in a predominant area that low income families rely, of the 21 children I care for, I have 3 that are private. 19 of them are on that subsidy-based program. So when you say that this process of receiving the money is questionable, how do I handle it? We have this thing that you call rob Peter to pay Paul, and then juggling bills that come in, and I can't turn my home away from these families because these parents have to work. But I can't ask for financial means from these parents because that's what's left of their ability to put food on the table, to feed this family that they're in. So not only do I take care of children, I take care of the family, I take care of the community. But at one point we have to ask, how long does a provider in California, a provider across this United States, do we continue to put this pressure on our back? So yes, I am concerned, even though we've come to a point where we're ratified, but the state's not confirmed that they're going to get this money. It's scary. It's on our shoulders. Do you tell the parents for them to have, there's no planning for that. I wish I can zero it out. Unfortunately, we cannot. But eventually, if that continues for a long period of time, you will see a lot of providers closing their doors, and there will be continued deficits. And it's an important structure to the early education to be that mixed delivery, because without the early education childcare providing that what we provide to the structure, you won't have families being able to get to those jobs that work in the weekends, the evenings, or overtime. Providers and parents work together to provide that love and care. And that's just some of the areas. And just to give a little bit more of an insight, another concern of them impacting, not only is that COLA, it's a small amount and continues to give us a deficit amount, but where is their agreement that we're going to move forth and get to that true cost of care? How long are we're going to continue on this path? It's sad, but there's a realization that we have over our shoulders. Like, we know we continue to cover the amount that we don't receive to provide for the true cost of care of these children. But we've reached understanding what it costs, and we love to get there. But at what point do we get there? Thank you.
Thank you. And sort of moving in order, Dr. Chapman, I wanted to ask, what impact would it have on your district if federal funding for the development and training of teachers and school leaders was entirely eliminated, as is the case in the funding bill for next year that the House Appropriations Committee approved, including, and that bill actually also would, I don't think that bill is going to be enacted by October 1st, but it has language in there clawing back money for Title I and for the teacher training program and for the after school program that was supposed to be, that is in law, already enacted and expected to be released on October 1st. So what impact would it happen on your school and your district budget?
Well, it's we can say it all along. Unfortunately, in education, we find ways to do more with less. Another example of it, some of those services we still have to provide. And so we still have to train our teachers, still have to keep them up to date. So that money will come from someplace else. As always, the money comes someplace else, which then will hurt something else. We really try, in my 14-year superintendent, what I always try to do is to never make a cut that will be felt by my kids. That's getting harder and harder. But sometimes when you think it's a cut that doesn't affect the kids, it does affect the kids. Teacher training will affect kids. Teacher retention will affect kids. All those things where those title monies go towards, even teacher recruitment will hurt my kids. And so sooner or later, the death by 1,000 paper cuts is still a death. And so it just depends on we'll find a way to make it work, but something somewhere is going to give, period.
I've only been doing Zoom for 5 years. I apparently still sometimes forget to unmute myself, but it is actually pouring rain where I am, so I'm trying to be muted when I'm not talking. So Mr. DeLonis, I had a question for you. If the delay in setting, you're the one who has the FAFSA opening on October 1st and students applying and trying to make decisions about where to attend, so you'd be giving them offers starting this fall. If Congress, once again, hasn't enacted new funding levels for Pell Grants, for work study, for TRIO, for SCOG, or any of the other student aid programs, C Campus that provides childcare for parents who have children. Look, how does that affect the ability of St. Louis University to make financial aid offers? Does it mean that you're likely to be offering less aid than you would otherwise be, or is there some other alternative that you just delay the decisions, or what happens?
Yeah, so we know that the longer we wait to send out aid offers, that drastically has an impact on our students' decision-making process on where they're going to attend. So we like to get information out there as soon as we possibly can, which means that we have to do it based on the information we have at the time, which is honestly at some point kind of our best estimated guess on where some things will land. And know that, so as far as your question on will that impact the amount of aid that we give students? Absolutely. We want to get that information out there, but at the same time, we have to be as conservative as possible. And if that means when we learn more information later, we can pull different levers to support students, that's great. But at the time, since we want to, right, align with the earlier FAFSA, which hasn't been that way for a long time. Not even 10 years ago, it used to open on January 1st, right? So things got pushed to an earlier timeline, pushing schools to adapt to that earlier timeline. And now families are used to that. So we want to be able to align with that to the best of our ability. And some of the other programs that have been cut, I mean, now when you talk about TRIO, you're talking about staffing, right? You're talking about eliminating positions, furloughing positions, and the uncertainty of the funding is going to be there for those roles, or if it has been eliminated, having to adapt. So it's a tough position to be in. And we know that building affinity with the students we are working with to attend St. Louis University is extremely important, and we want that trust to be there, right? So the more, I don't want to call it misinformation, but that's what it seems like to the student when we have to go back to them, maybe sometimes several times with new information, blaming it on the feds, which we don't try to do, doesn't go very far with that family, right? Our logo is on that piece of paper that we sent them, right? So we have to stand by that and work with families. And, I just think about even my community college days where that is the aid, right? So whatever is available and whatever is packaged for that student, if that changes, I mean, that's a direct dollar hit to whatever they were expecting. And I know coming from my family background, if that changes $400 or $500, that literally could be the decision whether I attend that school or not.
Or whether you attend school at all or not.
At all, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like the concern, one of the concerns that CEF members have is that the proposal from the president for fiscal year 26, which is the fiscal year starting in 2 weeks, and the proposal approved by the House Appropriations Committee both cut funding for the Department of Ed by 15%. And this funding, it will result in fewer students going to college. It eliminates adult education funding. The proposal for the Department of Labor cuts back on job training programs. The proposal for the Department of Health and Human Services eliminates the preschool development program. Overall, what they're doing is proposing to really pull back on the federal role in supporting education. I worry that at the same time, as we heard from the first panel, that a reconciliation bill dramatically cut funding for Medicaid, that state budgets are not going to be in a position to make up the difference and provide more funding either for state universities or for state school districts or for childcare, and that people will be stuck with a choice of doing less with this, doing the same amount with less or doing less. And those are choices that I hope that parents, childcare providers, school districts, colleges, and students who are looking at what to do, high school graduates trying to plan their future, I'm discouraged that they are going to have to make tough choices about what the options are available to them. I had a couple questions I wanted to ask open to all three of you. Where do you see the biggest needs for federal investments in education going forward that would impact your area? Mr. Turner, I don't know if you want to, it sounds like you may have told us already that you thought that increasing the child care development block grant would do more, but if there's other areas that you think would be helpful, I'm curious to hear from you.
Yeah, the child care funding block grant is a flat funded. If that can be consistently achieved, that would bring in more resources so we can really get to the true cost of care. That would definitely be the wish list. Another sector of that question, as we're talking about what really screwed us, and I hate to go backwards, but since I'm talking, I really want to bring up the immigration that was brought up in the first panel. The immigration process and what the federal government has done has really put a detriment in the parents. They're afraid to come bring their kids to school, not knowing what may happen to them or their children. And this is supposed to be a safe haven, but at the end of the day, if they can't feel comfortable being outside and coming to school, I live in that rural area where I have undocumented workers that work in our community, that work outside of our community because they have to travel to get work, but they rely on me and our programs, providers, to provide that love and cherish for those children, and it's not the children's fault. So in those areas, if we can have stability and knowing that that block grant can increase, we can really take care of all of our issues that we need to focus on building education and making it primary focus for us. Thank you.
Does either of the other panelists want to talk about sort of what is a big need for federal investment in education that you think would make a difference for your?
I'll go first, kind of earlier, but I mean, realistically, in a school district, there are three main areas where we really receive our federal funds from: special ed, Title I, and the school lunch program. Don't forget the school lunch program. For a school, that is a very large expenditure for federal dollars. But like I said before, I think realistically, the biggest impact that would help the most schools across the country, hands down, would be fully funding IDEA, because we all have a large and growing population of special needs students in our schools. Those are not going to go away. They're never going to go away. It is costing more and more to service those kids. Honestly, the numbers are going up because because people are much better at being identified. And so it's not that they're over-identifying, it's that they're better identifying them now. And so we need, those funds would go the fastest to every single school district across the country to make a difference with the federal dollar.
Yeah, now I'll jump in. I'm going to have to go with doubling the federal Pell Grant, right? Like restore its purchasing power. It used to cover half the average cost of a public university, and now it doesn't even come close to that, right? It'll help reduce student debt, expand access, bring it back to the original purpose and make the dollar stretch further. And then really, I mean, timely, since we're talking about OB3, is I am concerned about the elimination of Grad Plus loans, right? We have a medical school, and I do fear that if we could have doctor shortages, right? Like, and you can look at the data, doctors are not the ones not paying back their loans, right? You can that's an easy one there. So that one from a timely perspective, and then I try not to be in front of an audience like this without mentioning doubling Pell Grants.
Thanks. Yeah, when Pell was created something like 53 years ago, it covered most of the cost, the average cost of attending college. And I think at this point it's far less than 30% of the average cost of college, and a lot of things have changed in that time. But there's lots of ways where the federal commitment to I like to think of these and call them investments, even though the name of our organization is Committee for Education Funding. If we were redoing this, I think we would talk about investing, because these are dollars that are invested in the education of a child or the support of a family to allow their education to go forward, or investing in teacher preparation so that you've got a high quality teacher in every class. You've got counselors, that you've got the services that children need after school, before school, in preschool, and that hopefully make us a stronger nation overall, and certainly in our investments in the economy overall. With that, I think I will wrap up a couple minutes early. I want to thank the three of you for taking the time to talk to us, and want to mention that we'll have the recording of this video on CEF's website, which is cef.org, on the events page. We'll also share the slides that the first panel's speakers used with everybody who registered for the briefing, and always are offering, if there's a question that the public or congressional staff or others have about education funding, there is very likely a member of CEF who is an expert in that area and can help with. But we also have access to amazing practitioners and experts, as you've heard from this first panel and this panel, who are willing to share their knowledge and experience with us, and I greatly appreciate it. I think that's all that I wanted to say, but any closing remarks for the three of you, any of the three of you? Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it.